All right, well, welcome to the next episode of our QC Conversations. If you're brand new to the channel, I want to give you a huge welcome. My name's Dan Patterson, and here at Questioning Christianity, our heartbeat is to help connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. We're really convinced that truth invites questioning, and so these long-form conversations are a way for us to invite on an expert to sit in the hot seat and field all the tricky questions that you send our way. And today, as an episode spotlighting the Gospels, the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and why any thinking person would believe them, I've brought on an old friend of mine and someone eminently qualified to answer your questions. Let's say welcome to Peter J. Williams. It's great to have you on the channel, Peter.
It's great to be with you.
Mate, we've done some speaking together in the past. I remember seeing you do a presentation, and since then, looking at the Gospels and their historical reliability, you wrote this fantastic book, Can We Trust the Gospels? I want to give it a huge shout out on the channel and say, if you're looking, everyone needs to get hold of that and read through for some more in-depth content on what we're looking at tonight. But Peter, just maybe by way of introduction, have you got 1 or 2 minutes just to sketch out a bit of your own story and how you came to sort of faith in Jesus?
Yeah, so I'm 52, English, brought up in a family of Christians, and wanted to learn languages that helped me understand the Bible. So I actually went to Cambridge University and did Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic as my undergraduate degree. So all those sort of ancient languages related to the Bible and its culture. And in that time, really encountering people who have very different views of things, went through a period of doubt and searching myself, and came round to think actually there are good reasons to trust what I've been taught. And so since then, I've been involved academically in all sorts of ways, lecturing in the University of Aberdeen, and now in Cambridge, leading this Bible research centre called Tyndale House at tyndalehouse.com, if I can plug our website.
Totally. And you can actually jump on there as well to see a bit more of a bio about you, including a really long list of things that you've written. So Can We Trust the Gospels is sort of the popular level book entry for probably most of our audience and listeners. But I was reading the list of articles and books that you've written, and there are titles I can't even pronounce, which definitely in the nerdy sense gives the impression that you're well familiar with ancient languages, no longer spoken, but I'm glad people like you can understand them to help bring those mysteries to the fore for us. Just in terms of jumping in to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, sort of the 4 Gospels here, maybe for people that are listening in and thinking, these are religious books, biased authors, why should I even care about a conversation around the historical reliability of these 4 Gospels? What's at stake in this conversation?
Well, I think it's worth thinking about just because at a basic reason, there are about 2 million followers, 2 billion followers of Jesus or more on the planet. And so if you're curious about what other people on the planet think, and I think you should be, you ought to look into it. I think you could argue that Jesus has been the most influential person in history. That's another reason to look into it. But beyond that, I think there's even more, because if Christianity is true and Jesus came back from the dead, and we all know we're going to die sometime, that's pretty life-changing in terms of what we should do today. So I think there are lots of reasons to look into it, and anyone who's remotely intellectually curious ought to be doing so.
Yeah, like I remember as someone who finished high school and wasn't really a believer in God at that point, I probably was a bit more apathetic, like maybe some of the people watching this right now, or when it comes to the God question. Someone challenged me as I was thinking about what am I going to do with my life? What should I be aiming for? How do we make sense of evil and suffering in the world? And someone said, have you read the Gospels? Have you read the Bible for yourself? And I remember for the first time reading through these 4 stories about Jesus, these biographies, and just being struck not only by the way that Jesus touched on some of these deep questions that I was wrestling with, but also how he raised a bunch of other ones that were very confronting, that I had to deal with, like death and life and who can we trust in the world and what actually leads to a good and meaningful life? What was it all designed for? And so, I thoroughly recommend that sort of inductive approach to reading the Gospels and just seeing how it touches on these key topics. So we have these 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Some people may not even be familiar with why there are 4, and we might get to that. But who wrote these books? maybe as a starting point? Where do they fit in history? That'd be a great point to sort of hear from you.
Yeah. So the four Gospels are about 9 hours long between the four of them, and they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think that's because they were written by people called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Just analysing those names, Matthew and John are Hebrew names, and Mark and Luke, Marcus and Lucas, are Roman names, Latin names, which is quite interesting. There's a bit of linguistic diversity there. They're all in Greek. And they've got linguistic knowledge showing that they know the local knowledge of Palestine where Jesus was. So in terms of did those people write them? Well, Matthew and Luke are said to be close followers of Jesus. So out of his 12 close followers. So you could give a reason why those names would be stuck on things.
Do you mean Matthew and John? Sorry, not Matthew and Luke.
Matthew and John.
Matthew and John, that's fine. Hey, that's
Absolutely
why I'm here. That's why I'm here.
Totally right. Yeah. Okay. Matthew and John are by close followers of Jesus. Mark and Luke don't claim to be by eyewitnesses, and so I think there's an interesting thing there. That why would anyone put their names on the books if they weren't actually by them? That is, Mark wouldn't be remotely famous. Luke wouldn't be remotely famous if it weren't for the gospel. So I think that there's just every reason to think that they come from the people they're traditionally associated with. Luke, a doctor from Syria, and Mark, who is someone who was a follower of Peter, who's close to Jesus, and Mark probably came from the land of Jesus himself. So all of these traditions have got quite a bit of weight behind them. To me, they're far better than any alternative views of who wrote them. And that also gives you some sort of time frame in which they are written, because they're written within the lifetimes of people who could remember Jesus, and that's significant.
So kind of first century documents is sort of where the dating fits, within the lifetime of Jesus.
Yes, the way I look at it is they are close enough to the events to be reliable and far enough away from the events to be unreliable. That is, just the date alone doesn't tell you whether they're reliable. You actually have to dive in and examine them to see whether there are signs of reliability.
Well, can we do that then? Let's say someone's here, they've never really thought about it. They assumed that this is just religious propaganda. Let's write off these Gospels as not containing any real historical information about Jesus of Nazareth. What would you bring to the fore as some of your big guns, big reasons to argue for the historicity?
So what I think I want to do is, so you need to be patient, because there are layers of analysis, and any one layer of analysis won't do it all. But let's take a simple one, which is Jesus is supposed to come from Judea and Galilee, the land of Palestine, whatever you want to call it, where it's pretty hilly. And what we want to just check out is, do they know the land they're writing about? And just on a simple level like that, do they use the words go up and go down in the right place? Do they know the names of the towns, the villages, the layout of things, and so on? And actually, all four Gospels pass that with flying colours. Now, that's not a trivial thing, because that shows you either they're written by people who are in that land, or they're written by people who've visited that land and paid a lot of attention, or have talked to people who visited the land and paid a huge amount of attention, noting down really careful details. So any of those makes them, they can be quite careful researchers, or they could be people from the land, but that's just one layer. But then you build other layers. Because the thought is,
there's no Google Maps in the ancient world. There's no way you can have access to that information unless you were actually there or knew people that were.
Yeah, so people, even great geographers, can make phenomenally bad mistakes because they're writing about places a lot of the time they've never been. So you're really relying on other people to tell you what it's like some of the time. And then the problem is, which other people do you trust? So, someone says, well, I've been to Alexandria in Egypt and you haven't, how do you know whether they have or not? And so those are sort of difficulties that you could get if you're just trying to write a fictional novel. And what you're not going to do is then get the right jobs in the right proportion, like how many people are fishermen, how many tax collectors, and these sort of things. You're not going to get people's personal names appropriate for the place. You're not going to get the weather right, the local customs, all those sorts of things. So you run a whole slew of cultural tests, and the Gospels pass amazingly, they also down to local speech, they're getting those sort of things right. So that to me says they have to be people who are at least capable of getting reliable information
Yeah.
on Jesus.
So
And then
quality researchers.
yeah, then you sort of look at the things that Jesus is said to have said. And it's a remarkable set of patterns you've got. You've got some stories which have become, gone viral. They've been hugely successful. I mean, stories like the Good Samaritan, you get charities now named after that. It's very famous saying. Elon Musk the other day was saying how remarkable the teaching of turn the other cheek was. All sorts of things that have really made an impact. The golden rule, do unto others what you'd have them do to you. Judge not that you be not judged. The story of the prodigal son, all sorts of things like this, all come in those gospels attributed to Jesus. So how do you get so much creativity? And you can say, well, there's this remarkable individual called Jesus, and that gives you those things written up in the Gospels. That, to me, is the simplest and best explanation. Anything else is going to require one gospel writer to come up with one set of brilliant ideas, another one to come up with another set of brilliant ideas, but also some of them copying some previous brilliant ideas, and it just becomes really complex. So there's an argument simply from simplicity to accepting that these are good records of Jesus.
Some people would write them off pretty early simply because they include miracle stories. And I wasn't intending to like dive down a line of what's metaphysically possible, natural and supernatural stuff. But what would you respond to someone who's just, I don't feel like I can take this seriously just because, yeah, there's some cool teaching, but what's all this miracle stuff?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways. I mean, one is you could say, okay, I take the objection to miracles. Can we bracket that out for a moment and now look and say, if it weren't for the miracles, how reliable would you judge this to be? And I think that's one way you can take it, because I think that it's going to come out as, well, it looks pretty reliable if it weren't for the miracles.
Yeah.
Then
Sure.
I think you can also say, well, the whole question of miracles depends on your prior beliefs. So if you're a materialist, someone who believes that there's only material, that's all the universe is, and atheist, then it doesn't matter how much testimony there is about a miracle, you're not going to believe it. But you've got to dig down a little bit on that. For instance, a lot of colorblind people who can't tell the difference between red and green believe that there is a difference between red and green. They just can't see it themselves, but they accept there's lots of testimony around them that says there's a difference between red and green. Now, if you lived in a universe where everyone you ever met said that they believed they'd experienced a miracle, and you were the only person who wouldn't, would you believe in miracles? And the answer is probably most of us would. That's the way it is. So we do accept that there are routes whereby we can come to believe in miracles. We actually see these quite regularly in films where rational characters that we see suddenly encounter a superhero and see their powers or whatever it is, and they go through what we see as a rational process of such an overwhelming level of evidence that they say, okay, I'm going to believe this, So I do think that there's no particular reason why fully rational people can't believe in miracles. And there are, I think, about 200 million people on the planet who believe they've actually experienced a miracle, not heard of a miracle, experienced one personally. So
Wow.
a lot of the whole question of probability of miracles has got to be looked at, and you've got to look seriously at testimony.
Yeah, I'd love to do an episode, maybe all around that a little bit, and what makes for good historical evidence for a miracle and stuff. But coming back to that argument for the cultural familiarity that is within these four gospels, these aren't the only gospels in the ancient world, right? And so people like Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code and skeptics online make a lot of the fact that there are these other gospels, like the Gospel of Philip and Judas and Thomas and Mary and Peter. So what's the difference between the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and these others? Why do you write off these other Gospels whilst at the same time accepting the credibility of the ones you've just discussed?
Yeah, well, I would say there's a lot of difference. I don't write off the other ones, but I do think they are later, they're derivative, and they do have some systematic differences in the way they portray things. They don't have familiarity with geography and with the culture. Um, Jesus was a Jew, I mean, and the four gospels portray him as deeply Jewish. What you find is these later fan fiction gospels, which often have a different agenda, they sort of seem to have forgotten that because they're written at a time when Christianity has taken off, gone quite a bit further, and sometimes some of its expressions have forgotten their Jewish roots. So that would be an obvious case where these later things that come from, I think, the second and third century are further away from Jesus than the four Gospels. It's interesting. No, none of these apocryphal Gospels, as they're called, uses the name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the reason why is those names have already been taken, so you can't, take those again. And there are all sorts of things like that that you can look at where you can compare and contrast the four Gospels. I'd highly recommend the works of Simon Gathercole, one of the top scholars in the world on this issue, just for comparing four Gospels and other things. He's done the Penguin translation of these other Gospels, so someone who's very well read in these, and he's actually done quite a bit of comparison between the four Gospels and the others, and just showing how the four Gospels are earlier.
So, like earlier, and they get the culture of Jesus and the time right. With has a bit more of an ahistorical.
I mean, it's amazing just in terms of they know the different religious groups there are. They know the sort of things they're disputing about. They record people saying the right things at the right time. So the sort of conversations that Jesus is having around the time of a Passover festival are exactly the sort of things that people were talking about at that time. So they're aware of the calendar during the year. They're aware of the location, all these sorts of things that make sense of this being reliable reporting.
Even sort of the political tensions that you see between some of the key figures in the Gospels, like King Herod, and between Pontius Pilate as the Judean prefect. Yeah. And the more we learn about history and the enormous amount of work that goes into studying the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, or what they call Second Temple Judaism, it's amazing how much we can piece together now that gives a confirmation that those portraits in the New Testament, they really do fit the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, which is really cool. What do you make? You kind of hinted at it before. There's this argument around the reliability of the Gospels that it's almost like an existential ring of truth, that you read Jesus and he's hard to deny. I remember there was an interview that happened with Einstein, who was not a believer in a personal God, as best as we know, sort of more of a Spinoza's God idea. And he was interviewed in the 40s, back in 1940s, around the Gospels, and is Jesus just a legendary figure that's been made up? And he had this amazing response where he said, I am a Jew. As a child, I was instructed in both the Bible and the Talmud, and I am enthralled with this luminous figure of the Nazarene. And no one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. No myth is filled with such life. Jesus is too colossal for the pen of phrasemongers, however artful. And it really struck me reading this. So this is a guy that obviously doesn't believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be, but he said this personality is so enigmatic that no one can really invent him. And this has been somewhat argued more recently by David Marshall in his book, Too Good Not to Be True. And I'm just curious, do you think these ancient authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or people who wrote under that name, do you think they could have invented a character like Jesus who's had such an impact on history?
I don't think so. I mean, it would be the most phenomenal thing ever to have pulled off, because you're inventing the most successful story of all time. And you could argue that things like The Lord of the Rings actually sort of based on the Jesus story as very successful stories. You're also doing that so that the key figure at the center of that, Jesus, also has amazing stories embedded within that, like Prodigal Son, or the Good Samaritan, all sorts of other things. I mean, as in he is just full of memes, if I can put it like that, just things that really take off. So that's pretty smart. And then there's another level which it actually fits within a bigger story. That is, the Gospels fit within the Bible, and the Bible's divided into two parts: the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, go down to any synagogue, and they've got the Old Testament books. And how does their story begin? Well, their story begins in the opening book, when the first scenes in which you've got humans and dialogue is this tree scene at which they're taking the fruit, and as a result, they are estranged from God, and death comes into the world. So that's sort of opening scene. I think, well, okay, if that's my opening scene, what's going to be a good story arc to sort of close that off? Well, your dramatic climax in the New Testament is this tree scene. A cross, Jesus being crucified, and a cross, by the way, is a tree. They don't sort of plane the wood down to make it all smooth. It's a tree. And this is the scene where Jesus is crucified, and it seems to be that he's deliberately going to be executed, and is in echoing words from this first scene where he says, "Take, eat, this is my body." And just like in the Genesis story, she took and she ate. And this is the center of the sort of story of how life comes into the world, because he rises from the dead and he conquers death and so on. Now, that's a pretty good story arc. And yet we know that Romans used crucifixion as their way of punishing rebels. It sort of makes a ton of sense historically. You also know that this is being written up independently of the beginning of the Bible, which is the Jewish scriptures. And so you got that. Does that just come together by chance? And Jesus isn't just any old person. He's from this remarkable people group, the Jews, who are still around today, and he's crucified by their capital city at the time of their biggest celebration, deliverance, the Passover, all that sort of stuff just coming together. You think, how many coincidences I'm prepared to take? So I've got the bigger story, within which I've got Jesus's life story, within which I've got all his memes. And you think, like, are you just telling me some Galilean peasants came up with this? Does this really do the work? And I don't think it does.
That's helpful, and just the impact of Jesus. You know, his one thing that's really struck with me, and particularly in a time in the world where it feels like so many of our leaders, political, spiritual, moral, community, have been exposed at having a really dark shadow side. But to have someone whose own family members eventually are persuaded after his resurrection to come out and say he is the sinless Son of God, and to worship him and sustain claims like he is the light of the world, and in him there is no darkness, none of that shadow side, nothing winged. The personality and the sublime moral character and teaching of Jesus, it really goes a long way to that compelling, persuasive atmosphere for me personally. It was one of the things that drew me in, I know. Well, there's this other argument that you spell out a little bit in your book, Can We Trust the Gospels, around something known as undesigned coincidences. So this traces back to William Paley, really started to piece together some of the bits of different Gospels. But the notion, unfold it for us, this idea of an undesigned coincidences and these details in the four Gospels.
When I was a lecturer in Aberdeen University, and I'd set people essays to write, occasionally people would plagiarize. And we would then try and work out who'd copied whom, and you'd call them in. And you very quickly knew who was copying whom, because their story rings true. They've got all sorts of telltale aspects of their story, which will make sense if they're telling the truth or not otherwise. Now, what you've got with the Gospels is you've got this dovetailing, sometimes of details from one story that really fit with another story, things that the other person can't have known or can't really have thought about. And so you get this thing within, let's say, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, where in Mark's Gospel, it will tell you that lots of people are traveling around at the time. And so Jesus tells his disciples, come aside, let's get away from the travel. And so they go to a deserted place. And then but it doesn't tell you what time of year it is. But then in John's Gospel, it doesn't tell you lots of people are traveling, but it just tells you it's Passover time. Or, Passover time is the biggest commute of the year. Those two details sort of go together. And neither of the Gospel writers kind of just put their detail in to make it look true, because without the other one, it just wouldn't work. Almost like encryption keys, you need the two together. And so I think you've got this commonly in the Gospels, where you've got two different narratives with just some subtle element that dovetails, and that's what we often see with true narratives in our experience.
Yeah, it was one of the things that blew me away. Even the question, why four gospels? Why not just one gospel? Why isn't
Yeah,
Mark
yeah,
enough or Matthew enough? And certainly, I mean, they feature for different audiences. They shed light on different dimensions of Jesus's claims and what he did. They all
yeah,
have such commonality in the major narrative, but in terms of the teaching, sometimes take a different lead to serve the needs of a different audience. But all of a sudden, this notion that the four together bear witness in a way for telling the total story, that anyone on their own didn't quite do that. And these bits were
yeah.
minute, unintentional details, unlock features. And you do it masterfully through there. I remember watching you talk about the feeding of the 5,000, and then another one as well, I think with the stories around the crucifixion resurrection week, where I was like, wow,
Mm.
wow, that makes
Yeah,
so much sense as to why it strengthens the individual testimony, but also the collective witness of the four, that they
yeah.
support and strengthen each other.
Yeah, if we can go in a bit deeper on this one, I mean, the whole question, why four Gospels? I say there's a sort of optimal shape to the four Gospels as well, because you've got three which are more similar, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, which is a bit different. And that actually gives you the best possible data set for analysis. Because if you had four which were very different, you wouldn't know how to order anything. If you had two over here which were similar and two over here which were similar, you'd tend to think, one's capital A, one's small a, one's capital B, one's small b. You would decide which one came first, and the other one doesn't really matter. What we've actually got with the Gospels is, I'd argue, six different types of material. You've got things that are only in Matthew, things that are only in Luke. You've got a Matthew-Luke overlap. You've got things that are in Mark, and he also overlaps with the others. And then you've got things that are in John. And then you've got these, as well as those six major categories, you've got all sorts of tiny categories of overlap between things. And so actually, you've got a whole load of data to analyze, and people analyze these differently. There's some common ways that people can do that, but that is just a wealth of data against which to test any theory of how it arose.
Yeah, well, for someone who's, let's say you said 9 hours to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John back to back, you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you notice there's an incredible similarities. It's why they're often grouped together known as the synoptic gospels, sin meaning sameness. So there's a lot of similarity and shared content across those three. And then all of a sudden you get to John's gospel, which is about 80% unique material, mostly in the teachings of Jesus, the major discourses that he gives surrounding himself, and unique stories like the raising of Lazarus from the dead, in addition to the other two resurrections in the other gospels. But I know many people have said to me over the years, as you're having conversations around these things, that are more skeptical about the reliability of the whole thing, but particularly of John. They say, well, isn't this just evidence that there's development happening over time? So Jesus lived and ministered and died probably around 30 AD, maybe 33 AD, something like that. And he supposedly rose from the dead. And then you've got 20, 30 years before Mark's gospel is written, and then Matthew and Luke close by, and then John in the 90s AD. Doesn't this simply show that Mark is primitive? The other two slowly start developing, and then by John's gospel, it's just all this theological, legendary material that's accreted now as the stories have taken on more shape over time. How do you respond to that notion?
Well, again, there are many ways to respond. I mean, I happen to have a granny who is 102. Coming up for 103, and she can remember all sorts of things from a very long time ago.
Yeah.
So it's not really someone like John could write at the end of his life. That isn't really a determinative of whether it's reliable or not. And someone can write about something yesterday and it'd be a pack of lies. So again, the time scale is enough for it to be reliable. The whole question is, has there been development? Well, the funny thing is, you get these links between Matthew and John, which are surprising, because you get this way of speaking where Jesus will talk about his father and his relationship with his father, and this suddenly will come up in Matthew's gospel, and you can also find Matthew and John are said to be the two of Jesus' actual 12 disciples. Well, they're the two who do the longest discourses. The longest speeches from Jesus with Matthew 5-7 and John 14 through to 17. And they're both on recorded
Actual
by people
disciples.
who are actual disciples. So there are all sorts of things like that where you can look at, and you can look at the data in different ways. There's also an early church tradition that said John was deliberately writing to supplement what had already been said. So that can also be taken into account. Someone might say, I'm not going to do what the other people already done. I'm going to do different. So that's all got to be
He's
taken
more
into account.
enterprising in that way. It's like, what contribution before me as the last apostle gets off the scene? What contribution do I want to leave that maybe hasn't been recorded by the others that have gone before me? Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense to me personally. Can we run through another couple of critiques that I find come up pretty often? Let's just say something like a detail. So before you were offering general arguments for the gospel's reliability, saying they get the time right, the culture right, the history, the topography, the botany, the tensions, the religious groups, all of that. They're spot on. They're great. They do great on that front. But what about when they get some details wrong? And so one of the key ones that people that have been more skeptical of the gospel's reliability have pointed out is Luke chapter 2. We've just had Christmas here, and people look at, well, it speaks about the first census while Quirinius was governor is what provoked Joseph to take Mary back to Bethlehem. But the historical dating of Quirinius and any census seems to be put nearly a decade too late for that to be the case. Did he just get this detail wrong? And if there are wrong details, what does that do to our sense of whether we can trust anything in the Gospels?
Well, firstly, I do think this is a really good example. And for most people, it's the hardest historical question within the Gospel. So that's good. It's great.
That's why I throw it your way. We get you on here for this one.
And at worst, the situation is that Luke says one thing, and the main other historical source at the time, Josephus, says something else. And I think Luke is probably a little bit older than Josephus. And a lot of the time people say the Bible's got it wrong, but what they're already presupposing is that Josephus got it right. So at the very worst, I think you've got a standoff between those two. But actually, there are ways of fitting them together which don't involve saying either one got it wrong. One of them is about the translation of the word governor. So people often think that Luke's gospel has to be asserting that Quirinius was the governor of Syria at the time of the census. And let's say that's dated to AD 6 when he was governor of Syria. But the expression could be saying that this happened before Quirinius was governor of Syria. So there are quite a few possibilities. Sure. And you can get some paid up historians saying, no, this isn't insoluble as a problem. But what I'd say is a lot of the solutions have what I call low probabilities. Let's give them a 5% probability. Now, some people think I've got a problem and I've got a 5% probability solution. Well, that means it's probably wrong. But actually, you could have a number of different solutions, each of which have a relatively low percentage, but the chance that any one of them is correct could be quite a bit higher. And so what I'd say is I have no problem just historically discussing the probability of various solutions and saying, hey, it looks low probability at this point. I don't think as a Christian I need to latch on to one particular solution and say, this is it. I would say with Christianity as a whole, you've got all sorts of things that are working in its favor, with the idea that the books of the Bible, what Christians call scripture, have this supernatural origin. I think you've got all sorts of things in favor of that. And then you've got these, questions. It's a bit like, some days in your life are sadder than others, but, hopefully you have more happy days than sad days. Not everyone does, I know. Yeah. But I think it's like that with the Bible, that you've got all sorts of things in its favor and you've got some questions you're still working on. But normally people don't shift their paradigm of belief because there's a problem. I mean, people say to first year physicists, we're not quite sure how, the relativity and the quantum mechanics are supposed to go together. But that doesn't mean you sort of give it all up and say, well, it's all a waste of time, I won't study it. No, that draws you in to look more deeply. So I think there can be a problem with the way Christians present Christianity, because we can be doing a sort of salesman's job where you're trying to emphasize all of the positives of the product without anything negative. And I'd want to say that, it's not that as a Christian, you would have no intellectual problems at all. I just think it's going to, among other things, it's going to solve more intellectual problems than it raises, as well as, offering forgiveness, eternal life, lots of other.
There's a lot in the commended ledger. So
and
the thought being that there's more going for the general reliability of the Gospels historically. So this range of arguments that they can offer, and like I just like to highlight, if you pick your book, there's a whole spate of other arguments in its favor for general reliability, but you will bump up against some of these challenges. Historical facts, it's like, I'm not exactly sure how that pieces together, because we just don't have enough information to be able to resolve certain kinds of tensions. And I remember bumping into another one though.
And sometimes what the skeptics say online may be more reliable than what some of the Christians say online on some of these things, and that's fine. Let's have some humility about the dialogue we're having.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting even on the Quirinius one and the census, the notion that it mentions in Luke's gospel, this was the first census that was undertaken when Quirinius, and we only have evidence of one in Josephus. And so you're thinking, okay, how do we make sense of that? Is it just that Luke had more historical information available to him that he's drawing from knowledge of another census that fits too? So like you said, there are these possible explanations, just we don't exactly know how it fits yet, but you shouldn't necessarily throw out a whole lot of data for which we've got good reasons to trust based on the other arguments that you've mentioned. One of the other key objections that I get asked a lot about by young people who are wrestling with the Gospels is with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John describing the same events. Sometimes it seems like there's contradictions. And I remember famously listening to Bart Ehrman, who was Christian in his teens and went along to seminary and wanted to grow up and teach the Bible, but through experiencing suffering and then a critical study of the history of the Bible came to really doubt his belief as to whether or not you can trust what the Gospels sort of say about Jesus. But he made this argument around the resurrection accounts. So he'll try and piece them all together and says, all right, well, let's turn to the bit in the Gospels where it describes Easter Sunday morning. And there is women going to the tomb, but how many women? And what are their names? Because it depends on which Gospel you read. And when they get to the tomb, was the stone there or had the stone been rolled away? Well, that depends on which Gospel you read. Did they see one angel or two angels or two men? Well, that depends on which Gospel you read. And he just goes on and on and on about how the details in the periphery seem to be somewhat different or contradictory. So what do you do with those points where it seems like the different Gospels contradict one another?
Well, again, you've got to slow down. I mean, my analysis of the Gospels is that they agree on the very big things and the resurrection accounts. They agree on the empty tomb, risen Jesus. They agree that the people see the empty tomb before they see the risen Jesus. They agree that the people or angels who are seen are dazzling, but they don't describe Jesus as dazzling. So those sort of levels of agreement. Then they have differences on these mid-level things, and then they agree on tiny things. So again, between Matthew and John, you've got this lovely thing where when Mary meets Jesus in John, Jesus says, don't touch me, but go to my brothers and tell them I'm ascending to my Father and your Father. So your brothers when you've got the same, Father. That's quite an unusual way for him to refer to his disciples at the time. But that exact language is coming up in Matthew's Gospel when the women meet Jesus, and it says, they clung on to him, and also he talks about going to his brothers. So I think you've got those sort of details that fit. As for the numbers, I would say, there are at least, sorry, I've got some light there. There are at least 6 women who go to the tomb, but they don't all have to move in sync. So if, one goes into a tomb and another stands outside. They actually see different things. And angels also allowed to move. Angels back then don't necessarily look like angels in Vatican art. So angels are messengers from God that can look like humans. And in fact, that's what they do generally in the rest of the Bible. So all those sort of things that people could say, oh, this is difficulty. When you take them one by one, I do think that they evaporate. And a further thing I would throw in is I do think that what you've got is précis sometimes. That is, you've got a bringing together of a lot in a short time. But if you just take John's Gospel as an example, John has Mary Magdalene going to the tomb seemingly on her own. But then she comes back and said, and we don't know where they've laid him. So you think, okay, so there's more to the story than it's telling you on the surface. You then read through John's Gospel again, and you see that Mary goes to the tomb. She runs back, tells the disciples. Two of these disciples run to the tomb, and then it will describe Mary at the tomb, but it's not told you how she got there. So John's Gospel isn't saying, hey, I'm a complete record of everything that happened. It's telling you, yeah, I'm giving you select stuff. There are other bits you may need to fill in. Well, if you allow that to happen with the different accounts, you actually see there are various ways of them fitting together. There's not just one way. Actually, there are several ways they can fit together. So I may have my preferred version, but I think, there's nothing there that's a defeater to the idea that they can be all historically reliable.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's just who spotlights what details based upon the point of view in that experience. And we never include all the details when we tell a story. We selectively choose them to help get the point across without just what we omit as well as what we include. I do love the historical detail that John includes, that him and Peter had the foot race to the tomb and that John won. It's the guy writing it down. It's a little bit of a cheap dig at being fitter than your other brother. So in Luke's gospel, and this is one of the things I found interesting, is that they're not purporting to write propaganda, and they do a pretty terrible job if the gospels are religious propaganda for a whole lot of reasons. The counterproductive details that they include that make it harder to believe the story, or that they don't make mention of Jesus saying things that would easily answer early church controversies to sort out the headaches that they were having. So what's included and what's left out, and just it really doesn't pass as good religious propaganda if that's your end game. But Luke mentions in his opening gambit the goal of him writing is to provide an orderly account for this figure Theophilus. And so he's saying, this is, I've carefully investigated, spoken with eyewitnesses, want to write an orderly account. But he says that many have undertaken to write an account of these things. So we don't have many accounts that predate Luke. Maybe Mark, it depends on whether you think Matthew predates Luke, but that's two. What is the likelihood that there are pre-Matthew, Mark, Luke, John content, written down content around the life and teaching of Jesus? And what is the chance that one day in some cave like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or we're going to unearth another gospel account or like teaching? And what would that mean for Christianity if we did?
Yeah. So I think the answer is pretty slender. So I think when Luke says many, I see no reason why you can't have quite a few different accounts that have been written other than the ones in the Bible. And there's no problem with that. I mean, I should think that Paul wrote dozens more letters than the ones that survive in the Bible. So the whole thing for a Christian understanding of the Bible is not that the Bible is everything that God's ever said, because presumably he's been speaking effectively infinite number of words from all eternity. It's the ones that he has actually spoken and intends, people to have. So what you've got with the likelihood that you're going to dig up something new is you've got to remember that most literature doesn't last more than about 50 years because in the ancient world, because it has to be copied. So you're writing often on leather or papyrus. That's going, unless it's stored really well, is not going to last that long. If something's not being copied, it's going to die out. So I'm sure there were lots of copies of things, but whether any of them survive is relatively unlikely. Now, sometimes people think that something's been lost and then is found. And I've actually, found a bit of the ancient astronomer Hipparchus. Everyone thought that his star catalogue had been lost, and I was able to find it. Using multispectral imaging in rubbed out writing. It's pretty unlikely that sort of thing's going to happen with accounts of Jesus. And the reason why is you've got to look at the spread of Christianity, and as it spreads, anything to survive about Jesus would have to survive into the 2nd century for there to be quite enough Christians for it to be probable that there would be copies of it surviving today somewhere in the dry sands of southern Egypt. Because there aren't that many places where it can survive. Basically, no papyri survive from the Egyptian Delta. It's too wet. You've got to have dry conditions for things to survive. So there are possibilities that things that we thought had been lost will come back. You might get a quote here and a quote there. That could happen. But it's not looking that probable. We've now got several centuries of knowing what it's like to discover things. There can be surprises, but if discoveries are anything like what they have been in the past, then we're not expecting a lot other than from Egypt. Just about a whole load of caves in Israel have been scoured for repeat Dead Sea Scrolls without success. So doesn't mean that it won't happen, but I just think it requires hugely favorable conditions for things to survive.
Yeah. It'd be fascinating. But I mean, a key example, Papias, the early church father from sort of end of the 1st century into the middle of the 2nd century, we don't have his writings surviving to us, but they're often quoted in later church fathers. So, I mean, Papias, who was, as far as we know, was the first person to attribute Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the earliest writer to do that. But his work survives to us through Eusebius in sort of the 3rd, 4th century now. And so that's a key example. His stuff was just gone by that. We don't have it, but older guys quote it. But what's interesting about these other stories is it doesn't seem like these early church fathers quote other gospels beyond Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. So it doesn't really seem like these other accounts made it very far.
Yeah. I mean, there are some points where things could be discovered. You might get a bit of Papias that's been translated into Armenian that survives in a manuscript there.
Yeah, true.
You might find something in, as people read the palimpsest, the reused manuscripts of St. Catherine's Sinai. You might find something. There are some hopeful spots, but I'm not that hopeful about finding more Papias.
Yeah. Well, mate, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we're kind of scratching the surface on the reliability of the Gospels. If you just had to put a figure on it, between 1 being totally unreliable and 10 being you really can bank on this being true, where would you put a number when it comes to the Gospels as to how faithfully they report on Jesus of Nazareth?
Oh, I'm a 10, and I'm actually got a book coming out later this year trying to argue that the very words of Jesus' stories do go back to Jesus, and trying to make a case on that.
Great. What's the title of that? Has it got one yet? Working title?
The Surprising Genius of Jesus. So that's coming out with Crossway next October.
Mate, great little plug there. We'll have to get you back on to unpack some of that in another year's time. But I just want to say a huge thank you for being willing to come on and field these tricky questions. And I wanted to throw some of the harder ones at you because these are ones that people really are wrestling. So I appreciate just the way you're able to make sense of some of that. If people do want to track down more of your work, whether with Tyndale House or your popular works, where can they go to find more information?
Yeah, so tyndalehouse.com. Would be a good website for some of our resources, and they should be able to trace things from there, get our free magazine and so on. And also we're on various forms of social media.
So good. And if you had something of a parting message, maybe someone's watching this, they're either apathetic like I used to be to the God question to Jesus, or they're just exploring this for the very first time, what would be a parting message to someone who's a newcomer to the Christian conversation?
Yeah, I'd say read the Gospels. I mean, they're just 9 hours long. You could finish it by the end of the day if you've got no work to do. But otherwise, set aside a non-working day and get it done.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. And for me, that was it. Reading the Gospels about Jesus and then asking hard questions along the way. So echo that. Thanks so much. Well, Peter, thanks so much for joining us, and hope to catch you sometime in person when we're in the same country again.
That'd be great.
Thanks, mate. Well, thanks so much for joining this episode of our QC Conversations, really spotlighting the work of Peter J. Williams, exploring the reliability of the Gospels. Can we trust the Gospels? His book for you to pick up. If you're new to questioning Christianity, please do go ahead and subscribe. Click the bell for notifications so that you can get all of our newest content as it goes live. We don't just do long-form conversations. We have short 5 to 10-minute videos tackling many of these substantive questions that people have and trying to do that in helpful ways. But for now, we say goodbye and Godspeed. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.